truly an honor to have you here, and thank you all for coming, which I think is an important session because Nick truly brings a really incredible perspective. She talked about his background. We won't spend a lot of time because we could do the whole session about you. In terms of the leadership you have at the National Academy of Sciences, your leadership at the UC, University of California. But we are living in very interesting times, Nick, and not trying to age you in any way, but when you look back at many different, inflections that we've had, people say, this is unique, this is special. When we talk about all those different inflections, when you look at artificial intelligence, especially this session is about innovation, it's about competition. What is your perspective given, you deal with companies a lot, you deal with academics a lot, you deal with policy leaders a lot, so you have a unique perspective. So our audience would be interested to understand this moment. How does it feel?
Well, thank you, Sanjay, and it's great to be here with you all. I am actually, by going way back a long time ago, a historian, and so I've been thinking about the question of, is this revolution fundamentally different, or is it just another revolution along the historical timeline? And I think it is, and it is for several different reasons. If you go back and, everybody who writes about AI these days usually begins with the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, the first phase of the digital revolution, or, different modes of industrial revolution, first, second, third, fourth. But all of those revolutions, which were major in terms of the reorganization, not just of work, but of our entire societies, of our the fabric of life, took place over very long periods of time. And what is happening today, whether you believe that AGI or something like superintelligence or whatever is coming in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, or 20, doesn't really matter. The point, of course, that we're all here in Las Vegas to try to understand more about is that AI is going to, and we heard this from the congressman just now, change everything. And in changing everything, whether it's the future of work, whether it's the future of education, whether it's the future of healthcare, whether it's the future of leisure, whether it's the future of social relationships, whether it's the future even of how we understand what it means to be human, we're confronting something that could involve a total remake of who we are, how we live, how we imagine the world, and how we ultimately will live in this world.
So it is a completely unique, as you said, how we are, how we live, how we work. From a scientific perspective, is your organization making any changes? Tell us a little bit about how is the National Academy of Sciences looking at this?
So first of all, as a historian, I didn't necessarily encounter AI just years and years and years ago. Although when I was at Berkeley, obviously Berkeley is a great university, computer science, one of the top 3 programs in the country, a place where some of the leading real pioneers in artificial intelligence have worked over the years. And it was already clear back in 2012, 2013 that things were going to change, that there was going to be a revolution in terms of the ultimate dream of people like John McCarthy, who invented the term artificial intelligence back at Dartmouth in 1955. And of course, that was when neural networks were beginning to be used and explored and so on. And I watched this revolution begin and saw it unfold. What we did at Berkeley was to establish a data science program, which was actually meant to bridge computer science and statistics with everything else in the university, because we already understood that it was going to impact everything, whether it was public health, whether it was computational biology, whether it was even, questions in social science and so on. So we established this, and of course, that sense of the future has been vindicated. And over the last few years, we've all witnessed together the explosion in terms of large language models. But when we're actually looking at the future of AI right now, we're looking at a technology. We're looking at a particular domain within AI, and there are people friends of mine, ranging from Reid Hoffman to Gary Marcus, who have different views. about, even the release the other day of ChatGPT 5, but they nevertheless, I think, both agree about the extent to which this is a momentous set of discoveries. But it's going to impact a lot of other things in science, and this will go to the question of innovation. In some ways, science is moving faster than ever. In other ways, and various commentators have talked about this, Tyler Cowen among others, it's not moving so fast. Healthcare, some areas in biomedical science, amazing breakthroughs. Some of them related to immunological work, some of them related to the power that AI has brought to the lab bench. But other areas, really, we need to simultaneously, as it were, explode all over the place, because we need to figure out fusion. We need to figure out room temperature quantum computing. We need to figure out green hydrogen. We need to be able to figure out a whole variety of things. And then, going back to the world of biomedical research, we really need to make good on the kinds of developments that are taking place around cancer therapeutics, which are really extraordinary, around a whole set of other diseases that we have over the centuries learned to live with and die from, but which all of a sudden we now have the capacity to do major things to address, if not to live forever, as some people close to my neighborhood in Berkeley believe, but for a much longer health span, perhaps, than we have ever experienced in life. But the point is that AI is going to be central to this new innovation economy. And that's both extraordinary, it's also frightening. AI is both incredibly powerful and, again, and there are naysayers and doomsayers and others who will take this to a very, very extreme point, but potentially dangerous. And we already know the extent to which it has played a role in terms of the development of autonomous lethal weapon systems that are going to change completely the nature of warfare. But we also know that AI is only as good as the data it trains on.
Mm-hmm. You are at the AI4 conference, which you never thought you would be, but thank you for coming. Most of the people here are in the business of artificial intelligence. So a lot of them happen to be doing AI programming and coding for a living. Now, the beauty of AI is, as you said, it does great things, but it can also help you code. And it is impacting a lot of those kinds of things. When you look at technology, tools like Cursor, Windsurf, and many of those things, and you see that implication in the hiring, especially for fresh graduates. It is getting harder and harder for people who are coming out. Even with people used to say, get a STEM degree, you'll be okay. Get a CS degree, you'll be okay. From your perspective, we are seeing some major shifts happen in the economy. Some of these people work in those right now. Obviously, hopefully, they're all doing good because they're here. But how do you see this thing playing out, Nick?
Yes, question. And it's one that we ask in the world of higher education a great deal. Over the years, and I've had a few in the world of universities, we saw a change in terms of student preferences. For a long time, students would major in English, major in history, major in political science. Increasingly, they began to major in economics, business administration. And then, of course, it's been computer science, and it's been computer science for 15, 20 years. When I first got to Berkeley in 2012, I was asked by the chair of the department, David Patterson, some of you know the name, I need another 100 FTE, full-time equivalent faculty, to teach the students who want to take our courses. But now, as you say, if you graduate from college and you're just kind of a B coder, it's not clear you're going to get either a job or really be able to figure out how to work in and with AI. Increasingly, again, there's a way in which we're going back to a broader sense of liberal arts, because you need, as the congressman also said just now, you need to develop critical thinking. You have to know something about data. How do you find data? How do you test the accuracy of data? How do you actually yourself check the different kinds of ways in which LLMs can sometimes do extraordinary things and sometimes hallucinate. But the question of how and what it will take to train the next generation of graduates is one in which I think we have to really parse what it means when people say, as a kind of slogan, they say, it's not that AI is going to displace jobs, but people who use AI will take over from the people who don't, which is, again, an extrapolation of the general point, which is that it's going to affect virtually everything. But what will that take? And is it possible now to even think about AI as a tool in education that will do much more than we predicted 15 years ago when the first MOOCs, the massive online open courses, were developed at Stanford, and 170,000 people signed up to take a course in artificial intelligence and then dropped out. Now it's clear that AI is going to be embedded. It's going to be how students often do their research. I know I'm a professor, but my wife is preparing for her, she's teaching at Berkeley, and she's preparing for her classes in September, and she's using a variety of different LLM models to do research. And it's of course a question, what is going to happen when you get a paper that looks too good to be true? But that is something we can figure out. We figured out how to, use the calculator over the slide rule and the computer over the calculator. We'll figure this out. But what we haven't really begun to figure out is how is this going to change what it means to prepare students to graduate? And are even the fundamental structures of high school, the four-year college, maybe the master's degree and so on and so forth, is that even close to adequate for a world in which we'll live longer, we'll need to learn more across the full span of our lives, we'll need to prepare students to do a lot of different kinds of things and to have the capacity to actually learn over the course of their lives and not just pass some tests on the way to getting a degree.
Since competition is a part of this panel, I have two questions on that, Nick. One is, you had exposure in South Asia. Right now, when you look at the world of AI, there are basically three spheres, or you could argue maybe two spheres. It's, the European Union has the EU AI Act. We have China, which has a more centralized focus. And in the US, now our focus is, it's innovation first, regulation later. How do you look at it from a global competitive perspective? Then I'll move to the US competitive environment.
Yeah. So, the obvious distinctions between the US and the EU are that the EU is overregulated. I was in Paris, for the February summit. President Macron was very interested in both announcing that France was open for AI business, and he was in fact promoting, of course, a number of startups that were based in France. And that in the US we're much more innovative and so on, although there's obviously a great deal of conversation and debate about the role of regulation right now. I tend to agree with Eric Brynjolfsson from Stanford, who has said that a certain level of regulation is actually going to be, even though it's costly in the short term, something that will conduce to greater productivity in the long term. And we're not talking about 20 years down the line, he's talking about 3 to 5 years. But the real key there is going to be the stability of the regulatory framework. If it comes and goes, it's like every other political constraint or externality that effectively will make for real difficulty if you can't predict what's going to come. So I think it's important that we establish a certain level of consensus around regulation in the US and we abide by it, understanding that too much regulation early on can be very problematic for innovation. You have to be able to try a lot of different things out, and I think we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, and read this conversation about science and innovation, that sometimes we haven't taken enough risks in science. And I think we have a system and a structure for funding science, which is another conversation, but nevertheless, that needs to be revised, not with less support, but with more, in part, for taking risks, and then understanding that you may have to come in and regulate after the fact as opposed to before. But China's a different matter altogether. China's much more highly regulated in some domains, obviously with respect to the collaboration between public and private, state-owned enterprise, and so on. But it's also, of course, incredibly innovative right now. And that also speaks to investments in fundamental research. I spent a lot of time in Tsinghua University in Beijing, and I can assure you that AI at the top engineering university in China is very soon going to compete very, very closely with Stanford, MIT, Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon, and so on. And I think that's going to be reflected in the economy overall. So there are real issues, I think, beyond sort of the headlines of DeepSeek as to how we think about a global marketplace, but also a global regulatory set of understandings around AI that will allow us not to retreat into a kind of faux kind of AI nationalism that leaves us uncompetitive. We have taken a lot of comfort from the fact that Europe has not. China is. India is another matter, and that is something we could perhaps talk about later.
Yeah. Kind of getting a small hook, but I can't resist asking you, since we've talked about competition globally, AI is, if you look around, is dominated by the same 3, 4, 5 companies here. Is that good, bad? What does it mean for small business? A lot of small business entrepreneurs who rely on openness, open source, etc. Message for them, what do you think?
So we all live in this world in which, 4 or 5 frontier labs steal all the headlines and certainly get the massive market share of the $250 billion that went into AI investment just in 2024. And of course, just this also speaks, a little parenthesis here, but this also speaks to the question of innovation, because when you have 3 or 4 people who are saying, this is going to happen in the space of AI, with usually the release of a new product, and good people. I don't mean just Sam Altman and Dario Amodei. I mean Demis Hassabis, who does the same, even though he's in the research side of Google and he doesn't himself talk about Gemini or Notebook or any of the other products that are coming out of Google. But the kinds of statements he's making about, and he's a Nobel laureate, the kinds of statements he's making about the future impact of AI on scientific research and discovery makes you think, oh, okay, why are we even bothering with this? Now, just as a form of solidarity for those of you in smaller businesses, first of all, coming from universities which are large, but don't have anything like the resources to create our own systems of our own platforms, our own large language models. We've been watching this sort of growth of the frontier labs with a certain level of wouldn't we? And of course, again, university research is in the news every day, but we have nothing like the capacity to have the GPUs needed to really do the kind of work that needs to be done. But I think there are partnerships and ways in which the smaller companies, which are going to be more niche, more focused on particular kinds of product development, that will be absolutely critical for the ultimate implementation and success of the larger models that come out of the frontier labs, are actually going to win in the end. But you have to stick in there, and obviously when you're in a startup, that sometimes means just endless work and endless efforts at fundraising, which, by the way, I run a nonprofit. I spend my time doing fundraising too.
Awesome. And Nick, thank you so much. This was fantastic. Really love it.